On August 27, 1968, a woman identifying herself as Patricia Roxburgh, a Canadian national and freelance photojournalist, was detained by Jordanian authorities in Amman. The pretext for her arrest was minor, related to visa irregularities and suspicion of activities incompatible with her stated profession, yet the interrogation that followed was anything but routine. Within hours, it became clear that the Jordanians suspected her of espionage, not for Israel, but for a Palestinian faction, a misdirection that was itself a carefully calibrated component of a far more sophisticated intelligence operation. Her camera bag contained, alongside standard photographic equipment, several undeveloped film canisters which, under examination, revealed detailed images of a Palestinian refugee camp, information seemingly of little interest to Israel but of great value to rival militant groups. This discovery, planted with surgical precision, was the trigger. The Jordanians, eager to curry favor with their Egyptian allies who were deeply embroiled in conflicts with these same factions, extradited her to Cairo. To the Egyptian General Intelligence Directorate, the Mukhabarat, she was a small but intriguing catch, a Western freelancer caught in the complex web of inter-Arab rivalries. To the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service watching from a digital and human distance, the arrest of their operative, Sylvia Raphael, was not a failure but the successful completion of Phase 1. The objective had never been to gather intelligence in Jordan, the objective was to get their most resilient female agent incarcerated within the Egyptian prison system, thereby transforming the state's penal infrastructure into a covert Israeli intelligence base. The strategic problem facing Israel in the late 1960s was one of profound informational blindness regarding its most formidable adversary. The decisive victory of the 1967 Six-Day War had created a new and unstable geopolitical reality, but it had not neutralized the existential threat posed by Egypt. On the contrary, it had instilled in the Egyptian military and political establishment a deep-seated desire for revenge, a sentiment that festered and grew under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Israeli intelligence, while technologically advanced in signals and imagery intelligence, suffered from a critical deficit in high-quality human intelligence, from within Egypt's core decision-making circles. The catastrophic failure of the Lavon affair in the 1950s had resulted in the complete dismantlement of Israel's existing spy rings in Egypt, and the subsequent efficiency of the Mukhabarat made traditional agent recruitment and insertion operations almost suicidally risky. Every attempt to place an asset within the Egyptian government or military had been met with swift detection and brutal reprisal, creating a sterile operational environment where electronic eavesdropping could only reveal what was said, not what was thought or intended. This intelligence vacuum was particularly dangerous concerning Egypt's rearmament program, heavily supported by the Soviet Union, and its strategic war planning. Israel needed to understand the morale of the Egyptian army, the stability of Nasser's regime, the true state of their Soviet-supplied missile systems, and, most importantly, the precise triggers that would lead to another war. Without this granular, human-derived insight, Israel was perpetually on the back foot, forced to react to events rather than anticipate them, a vulnerability that could prove fatal in the volatile Middle East. Conventional intelligence-gathering methodologies had proven entirely inadequate for penetrating the paranoid, tightly controlled circles of Egyptian power. Signals intelligence provided fragments of conversations, often deliberately misleading, while satellite imagery could track troop movements but offered no insight into the intent behind them. The Mukhabarat had cultivated a culture of pervasive surveillance and public vigilance, making it impossible for a foreign operative to function using standard tradecraft. Approaching a potential Egyptian source was a gamble with impossibly long odds. The individual was more likely to report the attempt than to cooperate, either out of patriotism, fear, or a desire for reward. The few assets Israel had managed to cultivate on the periphery were low-level and lacked access to strategic information. The core of the Egyptian state, the military high command, the intelligence services, the presidential cabinet, was a black box. Previous efforts to use third-country nationals as intermediaries had failed, as they were subjected to the same intense scrutiny as Israelis. The situation demanded a radical departure from established doctrine, a solution so unconventional that it would bypass the adversary's strengths entirely. The problem was not a lack of effort or resources but a fundamental mismatch between Israeli methods and the Egyptian security environment. A new vector of attack was needed, one that did not attempt to breach the castle walls from the outside, but instead materialized, fully formed, within its most neglected and information-rich interior, the prison system. The target of this audacious new strategy was not a person but a system, a unique and complex ecosystem known as the Canada Women's Prison. Located on the Nile Delta, it was more than a mere correctional facility, it was a societal repository, a holding pen for the full spectrum of Egyptian womanhood. Its population included not only common criminals, thieves, prostitutes, and murderers, but a significant and ever-changing contingent of political prisoners. In the turbulent political climate of post-1967 Egypt, Nasser's regime frequently conducted purges of perceived rivals and disloyal elements within the military and government. When a high-ranking general, a cabinet minister, or an intelligence official was arrested, their families often suffered the consequences. Their wives, daughters, and sisters were frequently imprisoned on trumped-up charges, a method of applying pressure and ensuring the disgraced official's complete isolation. These women, stripped of their status and privilege, brought with them into the squalor of Canada an unparalleled wealth of intimate knowledge. They had been privy to dinner-table conversations, overheard phone calls, and understood the nuanced personal rivalries and alliances that truly dictated policy. They knew which generals were competent and which were corrupt, which ministers had the president's ear, and what anxieties were keeping their powerful husbands and fathers awake at night. This human intelligence, raw and unfiltered, was a potential goldmine, but it was locked away behind prison walls, inaccessible to the outside world. The operational challenge was therefore twofold: first, to insert an operative into this closed system, and second, for that operative to survive, navigate its complex social hierarchies, and successfully cultivate these high-value sources without ever revealing her true purpose. The solution, conceived in the highest echelons of Mossad and codenamed Operation Locket, was as brilliant as it was perilous. It proposed to leverage the Egyptian state's own security apparatus against itself. Instead of trying to evade arrest, the operative would actively seek it. The plan called for a female agent, possessing a unique and robust psychological profile, to be intentionally captured by an Arab intelligence service on a plausible but ultimately non-critical charge. This charge had to be carefully selected, serious enough to warrant extradition to Egypt and a lengthy prison sentence, but not so severe as to suggest she was a state-level Israeli operative, which would lead to execution or complete isolation. Espionage for a Palestinian faction or a Western business interest was deemed the ideal cover. Once incarcerated in Canada, the operative's mission would begin. She would not be an inmate awaiting rescue, but an active field agent deployed to a uniquely hostile environment. Her primary task was to build relationships with the politically connected prisoners, exploiting the shared misery and isolation of prison life to forge bonds of trust and dependency. She would become a confidant, a source of comfort, and, in doing so, a passive collector of invaluable intelligence. The plan was a high-wire act of psychological manipulation, predicated on the assumption that even the most loyal individuals, when broken by the state and stripped of all hope, would seek solace and inadvertently reveal state secrets to a sympathetic ear. The obstacles to the success of Operation Locket were monumental, each capable of causing catastrophic failure. The first and most significant was the risk of the operative breaking under interrogation. The Mukhabarat were notorious for their brutal and sophisticated methods of physical and psychological torture. The agent would have to withstand this initial onslaught while flawlessly maintaining her cover story, a feat requiring almost superhuman mental fortitude. Any crack in her legend, any slip of the tongue, would expose the entire operation and result in her certain death. A second major obstacle was communication. Once inside Canada, the operative would be almost completely cut off from her handlers. A reliable and secure method for exfiltrating the intelligence she gathered had to be devised. This was a formidable technical challenge, as all mail was censored and all visitors were monitored. The solution would require immense creativity, potentially involving complex steganographic techniques, the use of released prisoners as unwitting couriers, or other, even more esoteric, forms of covert communication. Finally, there was the long-term psychological degradation of the agent herself. Years of genuine imprisonment, surrounded by violence, deprivation, and despair, could erode the resolve of even the most dedicated operative. The mission required her to form genuine emotional connections with her targets to elicit information, a process that could dangerously blur the lines between her cover identity and her true self. The risk was not just that she might fail her mission, but that she might lose her own identity in the process, becoming a permanent casualty of the very operation she was meant to command. The individual selected for this uniquely demanding mission was Sylvia Raphael. Her profile was so perfectly suited to the operation's requirements that it seemed almost preordained. Born in South Africa to a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish, atheist father, she grew up outside the traditional confines of ideological indoctrination, developing an independent and resilient mindset. Her move to Israel and her time on a kibbutz demonstrated a commitment to the state, but her motivations were complex, rooted more in a personal search for identity and purpose than in rote nationalism. This psychological nuance made her an ideal candidate for deep cover work, as she possessed an innate ability to inhabit other personas. She was a gifted linguist, fluent in English, Afrikaans, Hebrew, and with a remarkable aptitude for acquiring new languages and accents, including the specific dialect of Arabic she would need. Physically, she was unassuming, capable of blending into a crowd, yet she possessed a quiet charisma that drew people to her. Mossad psychological evaluators noted her exceptional emotional intelligence, her capacity for empathy, and, paradoxically, her core of cold, analytical detachment. She could genuinely connect with people while simultaneously assessing their value as intelligence assets. Her training was an exercise in extreme mental and physical conditioning. She spent months in simulated prison environments, subjected to mock interrogations that pushed her to the very limits of her endurance. She rehearsed the life of Patricia Roxburgh until it was no longer a script but a second nature, complete with a fully fleshed-out childhood, career history, and a portfolio of personal memories and emotional triggers. She was not just trained to be a spy, she was systematically deconstructed and rebuilt into a living, breathing legend. The construction of the Patricia Roxburgh identity was a masterclass in the art of the legend. It was designed not merely to be a cover, but a fully realized human being with a verifiable past and a plausible present. Mossad's Documents Division worked for over a year to build her backstory. They created a birth certificate in Vancouver, school records, a university diploma in journalism from a Canadian university, and a complete financial history, including bank accounts with years of legitimate-looking transactions. A portfolio of her photojournalistic work was fabricated, featuring professionally taken photographs from various global locations, complete with fake bylines in obscure international magazines. This portfolio was carefully curated to support her narrative of being a freelancer with a penchant for conflict zones and human interest stories, providing a perfect justification for her presence in the Middle East. Mossad even established a correspondence with a family in Canada, in reality, a team of Kotzes, case officers, at a safe house, who would write her letters and send her packages once she was imprisoned. These letters would serve a dual purpose. They would reinforce the authenticity of her identity to the Egyptian prison authorities and, more importantly, they would contain coded messages, a vital link to her handlers. Every detail was considered, from the brand of cigarettes she smoked to the type of books she read. She was given props to further solidify her persona, including a worn copy of a Graham Greene novel and a series of letters from a fictitious former lover, all designed to paint a picture of a slightly naive, apolitical, and world-weary adventurer who had simply gotten in over her head. The technological and tactical elements of the operation were equally meticulous, focusing primarily on the critical challenge of communication from within a high-security prison. The primary method chosen was a sophisticated system of steganography embedded within her letters to her family in Canada. The system did not rely on invisible ink or simple ciphers, which were likely to be detected by prison censors. Instead, it was a keyword-based code integrated into the seemingly innocuous prose of her letters. Specific, pre-agreed-upon words or phrases, when used in a certain sequence or context, would convey detailed information. For example, a mention of her Aunt Mildred's health might correlate to the morale of a specific general's wife, while a comment about the winter weather in Vancouver could describe the political climate within Sadat's inner circle. This required Raphael to possess a perfect memory of a complex codebook, a mental one-time pad that could never be written down. To transmit more complex data, a secondary system involving microdots was prepared. Raphael was trained in a photographic reduction process that could shrink a full page of text down to a dot less than a millimeter in diameter. This dot could then be concealed within the period of a sentence or the postmark on an envelope. The physical transfer of such a letter out of the prison was the highest risk element. The plan called for her to befriend prisoners nearing their release date, particularly low-level foreign inmates who were less likely to be thoroughly searched. She would entrust them with a letter to be mailed from outside the prison, a seemingly innocent request from one inmate to another, which would in fact be the exfiltration of critical intelligence. The tactical planning for her arrest was just as precise. Mossad's analysis determined that being arrested in Jordan for suspected involvement with Palestinian militants offered the highest probability of extradition to Egypt without raising direct suspicions of Israeli involvement, effectively using regional politics as a smokescreen for her insertion. The operational phase began with Sylvia Raphael's arrival in Amman under the guise of Patricia Roxburgh. She moved with the calculated carelessness of a freelance journalist, making contact with known Palestinian sympathizers and photographing locations that were under the surveillance of Jordanian intelligence. She allowed herself to be observed, to be noted, to become a person of interest. Her arrest, when it came, was not a surprise but a scheduled event. During the initial Jordanian interrogations, she performed her role flawlessly. She projected a mixture of fear, indignation, and naivety, admitting only to being a journalist trying to get a story, a narrative perfectly supported by the evidence they found. She never confessed to espionage, as that would have been out of character for the legend. Instead, she allowed their suspicions to solidify on their own. The subsequent extradition to Cairo was swift. In the hands of the Mukhabarat, the pressure intensified dramatically. She was subjected to days of sleep deprivation, prolonged stress positions, and relentless psychological manipulation. The interrogators confronted her with inconsistencies in her story, with threats against her family, and with promises of leniency in exchange for a confession. Through it all, she clung to the core of the Patricia Roxburgh persona, never deviating from the established narrative. She cried, she expressed confusion, she got angry, but she never broke. Her steadfast denial of being anything more than a foolish journalist, combined with the lack of any evidence linking her to Israel, eventually led the Egyptians to a crucial conclusion: she was a low-level operative, likely working for the PLO or a similar group, and not a significant threat to Egyptian national security. She was tried, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 15 years in Canada prison. The gates closed behind her, and Operation Locket moved to its most critical and dangerous phase. Inside Canada, Sylvia Raphael ceased to be an active operative in the traditional sense and became a creature of pure patience and observation. The initial months were a brutal education in survival. The conditions were squalid, the food was barely edible, and violence was a constant feature of daily life. She understood that her first task was not to gather intelligence but to establish her identity within the prison's rigid social structure. As Patricia Roxburgh, the Canadian journalist, she was an anomaly, an outsider. She used this to her advantage, cultivating an aura of apolitical neutrality. She offered no opinions on the Arab-Israeli conflict and showed no interest in the political intrigues that consumed many of the other inmates. Instead, she focused on small acts of humanity. She shared the contents of the packages she received from her family in Canada: chocolate, soap, books, items of immense value in the prison economy. She was a willing listener, offering a sympathetic ear to any woman who needed to unburden herself, never judging, never probing, simply absorbing their stories of loss, betrayal, and despair. Her primary targets were the wives and relatives of the purged Egyptian elite. She identified them through careful observation and prison gossip, slowly and methodically building a relationship with each one. With the wife of a disgraced Air Force general, she would discuss literature and poetry. With the daughter of a former cabinet minister, she would talk about fashion and life in the West. She created a space of normalcy and empathy in an environment defined by its absence. She never asked direct questions about their husband's work or political affairs. Instead, the information came to her organically, woven into conversations about family life, personal anxieties, and complaints about the injustice of their situation. A wife's lament about her husband's frustration with the new Soviet missile systems would provide invaluable technical intelligence. A daughter's angry recollection of a dinner party argument would reveal deep schisms within Sadat's cabinet. Sylvia Raphael became a passive receptacle for secrets, her mind a silent recording device, capturing the data that would shape Israel's understanding of its enemy from within. The process of cultivating these unwitting assets was a slow, deliberate burn, demanding a profound understanding of human psychology. Raphael recognized that these women, stripped of their social standing and abandoned by the state their husbands had served, were starved for validation and empathy. Her strategy was to provide it unconditionally. She learned the birthdays of their children, listened for hours to stories about their former lives of privilege, and offered comfort during their darkest moments of depression. This investment in emotional labor paid dividends. They began to see Patricia not as a fellow prisoner, but as their only true friend, the one person who understood their plight without judgment. In this context of intimate trust, the flow of information became a natural byproduct of their friendship. The wife of a senior military intelligence officer, worried about her husband's safety, might inadvertently describe the internal security protocols of his department. The sister of a logistics corps general, complaining about the family's sudden financial hardship, could reveal critical details about supply chain vulnerabilities in the Egyptian army. Raphael never wrote any of this down. She committed every detail to memory, cross-referencing information from different sources, building a mosaic of the Egyptian state's inner workings. She learned about troop readiness on the Suez Canal, the real performance specifications of Soviet-supplied hardware, the political infighting between the military and the intelligence services, and the deep-seated corruption that plagued the officer corps. Each piece of information was a thread, and she was patiently weaving them together into a comprehensive intelligence tapestry, all from a 6-by-8-foot cell. The climax of Operation Locket was not a single, dramatic event but a series of quiet, successful transmissions of high-value intelligence. The first major breakthrough occurred approximately 18 months into her incarceration. Through her carefully cultivated relationship with the wife of a high-ranking general in the Egyptian Third Army, Raphael learned specific details of a new, comprehensive plan for crossing the Suez Canal. The plan, codenamed Operation Badr, was still in its conceptual stages, but the details she gleaned, concerning the use of high-pressure water cannons to breach the sand ramparts of the Bar-Lev line and the precise coordination of artillery and infantry, were of immense strategic importance. This was not battlefield gossip, this was the core of Egypt's future war strategy. The challenge now was to transmit this information securely. Raphael activated the communication plan. She composed a long, rambling letter to her sister in Vancouver, filling it with mundane details about prison life. Embedded within the text, following the prearranged steganographic key, were the critical elements of the Egyptian plan. She then identified a Dutch inmate, imprisoned for a minor currency violation and scheduled for release in 2 weeks. Over those 2 weeks, Raphael intensified her friendship with the woman, sharing her food and offering her books. A few days before the woman's release, Raphael made her request, explaining that she was worried the prison censors would discard her letter and asking if the woman would be kind enough to mail it for her once she was in Europe. The Dutch woman, grateful for Raphael's kindness, readily agreed. The letter was passed, undetected, and mailed from Amsterdam. When it arrived at the Mossad front company in Canada, it was immediately decoded. The intelligence it contained sent shockwaves through the Israeli defense establishment, providing the first concrete evidence of the seriousness and sophistication of Egypt's offensive planning. The concept was proven, Canada Prison was now a productive Israeli intelligence outpost. Following this initial success, the flow of information continued. Raphael utilized several different methods for exfiltration, never relying on the same technique twice in a row to avoid establishing a detectable pattern. On one occasion, she used the microdot system, concealing a dot containing technical specifications of a new Soviet anti-aircraft missile system in the binding of a book she donated to a departing prisoner. On another, she passed verbal information, coded as a personal message to her family, through a visiting consular official from a neutral country who had been subtly cultivated by Mossad assets abroad. Each transmission was a high-stakes gamble, but her meticulous tradecraft and the deep trust she had built with her fellow inmates ensured her success. The intelligence she provided was unique in its quality and perspective. While Sigint and Imant could provide a picture of Egypt's order of battle, Raphael's reporting provided a picture of its soul. She reported on the plummeting morale within the families of the officer corps, the growing disillusionment with President Sadat's leadership, and the pervasive sense that another war was not only inevitable but necessary to restore national honor. This psychological intelligence was, in many ways, more valuable than the technical data, as it allowed Israeli analysts to understand the emotional and political drivers behind Egyptian strategy. It helped them to gauge Sadat's willingness to take risks and to anticipate the timing of a future conflict with greater accuracy. She was not merely a spy, she was a deep immersion sociologist, conducting a multi-year field study of the enemy's elite from their most vulnerable and unguarded position. Sylvia Raphael's extraction was not a dramatic prison break but a quiet, anticlimactic release. After serving several years of her sentence, her case was included in a broader prisoner exchange that took place following the Yom Kippur War in 1973, a war whose strategic contours she had helped to illuminate. To the Egyptians, she was still Patricia Roxburgh, the minor Canadian freelance operative, a small bargaining chip in a much larger geopolitical negotiation. She maintained her cover until the moment her plane left Egyptian airspace. Her return to Israel was not met with public fanfare but with a quiet, profound sense of professional triumph within the halls of Mossad. The operation had been a resounding success, exceeding all expectations. It had provided a stream of priceless, unique intelligence during a critical period, and it had done so at a minimal financial cost and, miraculously, without loss of life. But the success of the mission was only one side of the ledger. The other was the profound and permanent cost to its sole operative. The long-term consequences of Operation Locket were multifaceted. Strategically, the intelligence Raphael gathered played a significant role in shaping Israel's preparedness for the Yom Kippur War. While Israel was still surprised by the timing and scale of the attack, the information on Egyptian canal crossing techniques and military capabilities, provided by Raphael years earlier, had been integrated into defensive planning and wargaming, mitigating the severity of the initial onslaught. The operation became a legendary case study within Mossad, a testament to the power of unconventional thinking and the extraordinary capabilities of a single, well-placed human asset. It reinforced the value of deep cover operations and the necessity of investing in agents with unique psychological resilience. It also highlighted the potential of using female operatives in roles that leveraged emotional intelligence and social infiltration over traditional methods of espionage, a lesson that would influence Mossad's recruitment and operational doctrine for decades to come. However, the most significant and enduring consequence was the psychological toll on Sylvia Raphael herself. She had spent years living a lie in one of the world's most brutal environments. The person she had been before entering Canader was gone, replaced by a composite of her true self, the fabricated persona of Patricia Roxburgh, and the accumulated trauma of her experience. The empathy that had made her such an effective operative was also a source of deep personal conflict. She had formed genuine bonds with the women she targeted, and the knowledge that she had systematically betrayed their trust for strategic gain was a heavy burden. Reintegrating into a normal life was an immense challenge. The hypervigilance, the emotional detachment, and the habit of constant deception that had kept her alive in prison were difficult to shed. She had become a master of a craft that had no place in the civilian world. While celebrated as a hero within the intelligence community, her victory was private and her scars invisible. The story of Sylvia Raphael and Operation Locket is a stark illustration of the fundamental paradox of deep cover espionage. to successfully deceive others, an operative must first, on some level, deceive themselves, and the journey back from that self-imposed exile is often the most perilous part of the mission. Her life was permanently altered, a testament to the fact that in the world of intelligence, the most profound costs are rarely measured in budgets or body counts, but in the silent, internal transformation of the individuals who fight in the shadows. What is the true measure of a successful intelligence operation? Is it the value of the information obtained, or the moral and psychological cost to the operative who obtained it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel.